I want to start by reading a poem by the African-American poet Will Alexander, whose transmogrifications of words has inspired and influenced the work that I will talk about today. Its title is Fragment, Blaze as Unknowable Drift. Blaze as unknowable drift, as mathematical drift that blazes with ciphers. I've listened to moons eclectically rise, to conundrums blaze and ascend, not as molecules or distributed torrents, but as vibrational mazes, as curious oneric cartography. So my presentation and sort of performance today is going to have 3 parts and a coda. So I'm going to talk about the Transxeno Lab. There's going to be a part called Dear Interlocutor. We're going to have some sonic entanglements, and we're going to finish with a coda. So, the Transxeno Lab. The Transxeno Lab is an artistic research laboratory, as Alice introduced. It begun in 2019. And basically with the Transxeno Lab, we do artworks and presentations dealing with queer and trans futurities, alternative understandings of extraterrestrial space, possibilities of bodily transformation, altering relationships with time, and exploring different types of organisms such as lichen. And the idea with the Transxeno Lab and sort of the naming of it and everything is trying to manifest transdisciplinarity as inspired by Felix Guattari and chaosmosis, as well as Gary Janesco's elaboration on Guattari's methodology. So Janesco writes, a transdisciplinary assemblage must explore its transversality, initiating new and multiplying existing connections between science, society, ethics, aesthetics, politics, while struggling against reductionist versions of this process that have become increasingly pegged on profit and accepting a multidisciplinary fuzziness without real institutional commitments. So this means that there are a number of related branches of the Transxeno Lab that produce a variety of works, including the Transxeno Lab itself, which makes artworks and installations about the topics that I mentioned earlier, Transxeno Films, which produces multi-channel and panoramic films that engage deeply with the topics that I explore in my works, and we'll see a clip from one of these films later. Xenology Press, which publishes small pamphlets on allied topics, including the Fragments of Xenology that forms the conceptual basis of this presentation. Transxeno Lab Vending, where we sell t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, tote bags, and so on, that incorporate imagery developed for the various projects, which include protective and joyful sigils for queer and trans existences. Celestium Modular, where I design, build, and sell open source modular synthesizer modules whose function derives from xenological thought, and whose backstory itself is written as a science fiction story, as an example of one possible futurity we could find ourselves living in. And finally, Celestra, which is my performance alias, which also involves modular synthesizer performances, as well as experiments in radio transmission and antenna building. And I mentioned the commercial side of things, not to make this presentation into a commercial, but to highlight the experiments in different ways in sustaining artistic practice, especially when we are not supported by our research universities, because I work as an independent artist now, and thinking about this in the long line of artists playing with alternative forms of existence in capitalist society, such as the fluxes and their multiples, but perhaps this is a conversation for another time. So, xenology. Xenology is the study, analysis, and development of the strange, alien, and other, and a xenologist is one who engages in xenology. And this is a term that I've been developing over the past few years. It's not a word that I came up with, actually. There are 2 historical strands to this. The first comes from the 1950s and 1960s, where there were science fiction authors who were trying to figure out how would you reference the types of people in science fiction stories who are studying extraterrestrials. So in line with the idea of like a biologist who studies life, a xenologist is one who studies extraterrestrial life. Then in the early 1980s, there was also a guy by the name of Robert Freitas who said, well, we actually have xenologists here on Earth because they're involved in things like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and other sorts of practices. And so he extended xenology outside of the realm of the diegesis of science fiction stories into sort of actually existing people involved in these types of searches. But I wanted to push this a little bit further, and I wanted to think about anyone who is perhaps seen as alien or other or strange, and to think about what are the ways in which we can push some of this ideas of transformation, of otherness, of alienness into new directions. And I do this because I see the one constant of the universe is change. I mean, Lauren Oya Olamina had it right when she wrote, "The only lasting truth is change." And in later verses from Earthseed, alter the speed or the direction of change. Vary the scope of change. Recombine the seeds of change. Transmute the impact of change. Seize change. Use it. Adapt and grow. As long as there is no heat death of the universe, there's the possibility of change. The cosmos is change. Now, I want to say that I see poetry and science and speculative fiction stories as providing just as much theoretical and poetic power as academic theory, and so thus I quote from them liberally. So, transformation is change, transition is change, yet capitalism is also change. Capitalism requires change in order to find new avenues for profit. A society without changes is one where capitalism has failed. Nevertheless, capitalism only allows change that is congruent with a profit motive. This is a disgusting limitation of the cosmos' given capabilities of change, of transformation, of transitioning. Capitalist transitioning only allows Promethean-style transhumanism, the transhumanism of people like Musk and Kurzweil and Moravec and others, and the discredited notion of the singularity. It only allows AIs that repetitively generate the same thing over and over and over again. It only allows incremental adjustments to society that barely reach 1 iota of what is necessary to respond to the climate emergency. It uses manufactured wars and militarism and funds the colonial project. This is capitalist alienation. Not only a distance from the sensual qualities of materials, not only a distance from the human labor value embedded within objects, but also a distance from the possibilities for transformation. Hence, I came up with this word, xenomogrification. And yes, I like very complex words with lots of syllables in them. Xenomogrification is a term that I developed to foreground a form of disalienation from this limitation. A shortening of the distance from the horizon of capitalist change to the ever-expanding horizon of the cosmos' given possibilities for change. Here we have change and transformation that foregrounds the sensuous body, the interrelationships between our existences and those of other entities, a deepening of the intertwining of our lives and temporalities beyond our own, an exploration of calculation that exceeds the purely efficient. This has been necessary in our past, and it will be necessary increasingly in the transitioning times to come. Xenomogrification is always a process, as there is always more ability to disalienate ourselves from the capabilities for change. I don't know if any of these ideas and new words that I'm making are going to be of interest to others or even used by anyone besides myself, but it's the conceptual apparatus that I've needed to develop in order to do my work. And it's likely going to consume me for the rest of my life. All I can hope is that some of this will outlast some of my own conscious existence as well. Now, I wanted to go into some of the projects that I've been developing in the Xeno lab that relate to some of these ideas, and I'm going to talk about 3 projects. The first is called TX1, and TX1, I was able to launch fragments of my hormone replacement medications to the International Space Station. And like any project that goes to space, we had a beautiful patch that was designed by the Serbian graphic designer Irma Puškarević. And so what did I send up? I sent up these 3 small spheres, and these spheres are only around 5 millimeters in diameter. And these spheres were fragments of the hormones that I take as a transgender woman. And so on the left is a fragment of what's called a spironolactone pill, which is often prescribed to trans women to suppress testosterone. In the middle is a fragment of what's called a Vivel dot patch, which we take to provide us with estrogen. And it should be noted that this sort of a patch is also the type of patches that are taken by people with uteruses who are taking it for the purposes of perimenopausal or menopausal hormone replacement therapy. And what's interesting is that the hormones that trans people take are not ones that are specifically designed for us, but they're designed for other purposes. That's a whole other conversation to have as well. And then on the far right is a fragment of a handmade abaca paper sculpture to gesture towards all these xeno entities that I couldn't put in this project. And so this went to the International Space Station and orbited the Earth for a month back in 2020. And so this was the first known time that elements of the transgender experience orbited the Earth. And so it orbited there for a month, and importantly, it came back. So this is a photo of the vessel after it came back from space, and so I can hold it in my hand, I can exhibit it, and things like this. And for me, what's really important is that this gestures towards the fact that queer and trans lives are resilient. We don't just burn up in the atmosphere like so much does that goes up into space. But we can come back and thrive once again here on Earth. The second project I want to talk about is more of a speculative project, but that has very scientifically rooted elements to it. And it's called Xenological Entanglement 001b Saccular Found. And it began from the realization that I possess within my body the means of producing my own estrogen. I just need to turn on one gene in my body. Namely, I need to turn on a gene in my testicular cells that would convert testosterone to estrogen, because that's the biochemical process of producing hormones in the body. Testosterone is converted into estrogen. And so the idea here was to think about possibilities of genetic engineering, not adding new genes to my body, just thinking about how I can turn one new gene on, and thinking about maybe this is a way that I could actually provide my hormones if I wanted to go, say, on a long-duration space journey. But this was also important because it means that if we could do this, we could also free ourselves from pharmaceutical and juridical control. Now, this is a project that is conceptually feasible, scientifically plausible and everything like this. Had a whole plan of doing this, and then COVID happened. And I was in Ljubljana for the residency, and there was a lockdown and curfew, and it wasn't able to happen. And so it's something that I'm still looking at trying to do. So as a result, we did sort of a speculative photo performance about this, imagining a way to maybe grow my hormones on the outside of my body, using these things that you're seeing here, these small circular devices which are called clinostats, which are designed to simulate a weightless environment in outer space for different types of biological experiments that you would do in a laboratory. And so we did a number of different types of photo performances looking at the representations of bodies with respect to outer space and astronauts and so forth, and also thinking about the representation of the trans female body, which is often very highly sexualized in our societies, and thinking about different ways of looking literally through this imagery. And then the final project I want to talk to you about is TX2 Moonshadow. And the title, Moonshadow, comes from this, which is a zine that was produced in the 1970s by the Transsexual Action Organization, or the TAO. And the TAO was a group of transsexual women in the United States who were only communicating by mail because that was the only safe way to communicate at that time. And they had this newsletter called Moonshadow. And in this newsletter, there were descriptions of trans women as cyborgs, as extraterrestrials, and so forth. And it had this incredible psychedelic imagery designed by a trans woman, Susan David. And so in this project is sort of more of a provocation in a certain sense, because it's thinking about Mars and the types of discourse that's going on around Mars right now. And the idea that the best thing that we can do as humanity is to send humans to Mars. And I was questioning that because humans are not really very well designed for the outer space environment, nor the Martian environment. However, there are other organisms, like lichen, some species of lichen, that can potentially survive within a Martian environment. And so the idea here was not necessarily to send lichen to Mars, but to provocatively say, if we're going to be sending things to outer space, maybe we should have a conversation about what types of things we want to be sending to outer space. And perhaps we should have a conversation about the types of contamination that happen. Because to send another body a human body, a non-human body to another entity in the solar system, that is going to be a form of contamination. Contamination is not necessarily bad, but let's have a conversation about that. And so the project took this form as a 4 meter by 4 meter solar sail. Basically, solar sails are spacecraft that don't require chemical propulsion. They just move through space by the bouncing of light off this reflective surface. It's this amazing quantum mechanics thing, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want to know about. And so this 4 meter by 4 meter solar sail, the idea was that this solar sail would fold up into this thing in the center, which is called a CubeSat. And we designed this all to NASA ESA specifications, so it could conceivably fly if we had 100,000 euros. But the idea with this project was really to say, it's possible to do this. It's a question of imagination. It's a question of where we put our priorities and so forth. And that's a big thing for my work, is thinking about how can we use the actual sort of practices of science and technology and, as the situationists might say, deturn them a little bit, transform them a little bit, just swerve things a little bit. Part 2, dear interlocutor. Dear interlocutor, it's a bit strange to call you an interlocutor, as how can I have an interlocution with an idea, with hope, with the future of my species, with a volcano, with Xanthoria lichen, or a crow, or the Mississippi, with an extraterrestrial, with the cosmos? But I still must imagine that sharing can happen within the mixing of times, the fundamental hybridity of life, and concepts and ideas that flow across forms of language and representation. Maybe that's also why I express aspects of my relationship with the cosmos across different material forms, as a way of experimenting with the breadth of possibilities and hoping that one resonates with you. Plural you, singular you, undefinable you. And also, perhaps, with anyone who might be reading these letters. I wanted to tell you a story, and our stories tend to begin with a beginning, and mine originates from a tiny village in the middle of the North American continent. During my childhood, I did not feel like I belonged, for many reasons, not the least of which was the secret feelings of shame related to realizing that I was queer and trans, even if I didn't know the words at the time. A night when I was young, I looked up. I looked up, and I looked up. I looked up and I wanted to be there. To move amongst the pinpricks of light, to visit each one and say hi, to transform my inchoate body into light itself, so as to go away with such speed to escape the flittering cornrows surrounding my village that nevertheless acted as concrete walls preventing movement outwards, to escape the strictures of behavior that deemed my desires unnatural, to be amongst the imagined others out there who would accept me as light, me as body, me as me. Alas, it was just fantasy. Nevertheless, I shone a torch upwards, a stand-in for my leaden, dissociated body, in some hope that someone out there would see it, recognize it as a signal to be responded to, and to come and take me away. Obviously, this did not occur, as I'm writing this letter to you now, here on Earth. I know, though, that I'm not the only one who wanted this as a child, and may still want it as an adult. Nevertheless, human bodies are perhaps not ready to go to space for long durations. The xenomogrifications of the body, currently impossible and too painful to turn us into the cyborgs necessary to deal with the ravages of such an environment. Yet, I am still always looking up. But perhaps I've gotten too personal too quickly. Perhaps I've overshared. That's the thing about letters. They allow us to condense desire, to displace it as the letter winds through space and time, maybe arriving at its destination, maybe getting lost along the way. Encapsulated in their envelopes, whether made of paper or of a digital container, letters materialize a paradox of time and communication, that there is no simultaneous communication. There is always a delay, however short or long. And not only that, there needs to be a precise alignment of temporalities. The time of sending, the duration of transit, and the time of reception have to align somehow for the letter to be received. This marvel of communication between two or more things implies that we need to think carefully about the variety of times within the phenomena of being across organic, inorganic, and silico entities. And that scales from the quantum to the cosmic. Let me ruminate on this a bit more and get back to you. Hoping this reaches you, Adriana. Dear interlocutor, I wanted to share something with you that I made a bit ago.
The Hohmann transfer orbit is the lowest energy way to travel between two large bodies in the solar system, an arc of an ellipse between two circular orbits. It just requires two small pushes, delta V, at the beginning and the end of the trip. Delta V, it's the fundamental term in space navigation, the amount your velocity has to change to go from one orbit to another. Delta standing for change in. Delta V dominates us, and there's no safe word to set us free. Once you're in your final circular orbit, though, unless there's drag or some other force acting upon you, once you're in that orbit, you will stay there forever. Circling around, and around, and around, and around. Unless you get another push through another delta V. The domination is relentless. I think about my life and what delta Vs have been needed to push me out of static, boring, repetitive, harmful orbits. Of the stable orbit that I was in for decades that accepted forced masculinity and presumed that girlhood was forever off limits. But it wasn't just a delta V that got me out of that rutted orbit, the locked groove that had set the boundaries of my imagination. I needed more, a new kind of transfer orbit that incorporates other parameters. Call it a temporal transfer orbit, for lack of a better term. This orbit not only includes the delta V, but also delta T, a change in time. Delta H, a change in history. Delta I, a change in imagination. Such an orbit may take the same physical trajectory in space as a Hohmann transfer, but it will still do it differently. And most importantly, it will create things now that need to exist in order for a desired future to come to pass. Maybe in this temporal transfer orbit, we can begin to repair the mistakes of the past and live a bit more attuned to the possibilities of joy and commensal living with the universe.
Did you make the maneuvers to get into a new temporal transfer orbit? One separate from ours? Because we're quite stuck. As Agnes Dennis has remarked, we seem as honor-bound to our misconceptions as we are bound to this Earth. A TTO isn't meant to fling us away from the Earth's surface, abandoning it to the machinations of purely extractive machinic assemblages. Rather, the TTO merely perturbs the current trajectory slightly, which, over a long duration, can still have major effects. It's the clinamen of Lucretius or Deleuze, or even maybe the pataphysicians. Fields underlie all of this. Fields that are farmed, that are extracted, that are tended, that are cared for. These fields possess forces that draw beings to them. But fields also underlie contemporary understandings of physics, where we all exist. All matter exists as temporary solidifications of the underlying quantum fields. And fields have attractors, places that we are drawn to, we are drawn towards, gravitationally, emotionally, erotically, angrily. But perturb the trajectory just a bit, and we're off in a new direction. Maybe this oversimplifies things, or maybe it's actually the most fundamental thing, that all we need to do is perturb our trajectories a bit when they tend to get stuck in a rut. And by our, I mean humans, collectively. Let's meet where the field lines intersect. I saw you there already. Hopefully, Adriana. Dearest interlocutor, how can I reach you across the multiple dimensions of experience? Can I build antennae to transmute your signals, to follow how you move throughout the spectrum? I write not just a metaphorical antennae, as actual antennae made of copper or aluminum or steel or conductive thread are vital for the reception of radio frequency signals. Understand as well that antennae, by definition, can function both as receivers and transmitters. Reception and transmission are not positioned in a hierarchical relationship to each other, but are rather twinned, simultaneously both, transceivers of inhuman vibrations. Transduction translates twiddling into modulating manipulable manifestations. Nevertheless, there are antennae that pick up the minute variations in conceptual formation, bodily experimentation, or sociality that offer us new ways to be entangled with the universe beyond our current predicament. Sometimes when we try to amplify these signals, all we get is useless noise. Sometimes, though, that noise offers a new idea. And sometimes, because of our own constraints, we don't recognize the signal that was always there. Can you affirm the power of your antennae to transceive inhuman cosmic vibrations? Those are the elements that you're made of, and those are the practices that need to be energized anew. Attuned and attuning, Adriana. Dearest interlocutor, words sprout from the necessities that engendered them, their use nascent and possessing pure possibility. Structuring this use requires reference that may not yet exist. Saussure termed this the relationship between signifiers and signifies. What people often forget is that he also noted, quite clearly I think, that the sign only functions within a community of speakers, and maybe we can say speakers that are not always human. And the community needs to agree in part on the reference. How then to nurture the necessary words while the referents are being created, are in flux, when the referents don't even exist yet? A language that cannot name properly is one that fails in its most basic function, to allow sensual bodies a means of creating the world. There is no primacy, neither words nor matter masters. This tension between describing and creating is merely a mirage, for the two mutually constitute each other. There is no beginning, merely a continuous swirling. And perhaps a perfect example of this, translated through French to English, is Félix Guattari when he wrote, when talking about ecosophy, the chiasmic fold of deterritorialization and the autopoetic fold of enunciation, with their interface of existential grasping and transmonadism, implant at the heart of the object-subject relation, and before any instance of representation, a creative processuality, an ontological responsibility which binds liberty and its ethical vertigo at the heart of ecosystemic necessities. Thus, the imaginers and the poets take their proper place in the community. Imaginers who tend to the shoots of language that are too easily getting trampled upon in the haste to get to work and make profit. The imaginers construct the tiny scaffolds and crutches that hold up the sagging, broken frond of a new world struggling to exist. Once strong enough to move about on its own, the imaginer begins to compose the reference for the word to latch onto through their relationship with the poets. The poets and the imaginers tend to the chiasmic tendrils that flitter in the turbulence and uncertainty of transformation, of the transitioning times. The poets winnow weighty words into chiseled specimens perfect to the time stream. Old meetings are xenomodulated. Poesis pushes populaces palpably past putrid potholes. Alexis Pauline Gumbs seems to think about this similarly. Everyone knows we're made of stardust. They just don't remember what it means. What does it mean? It means if we can walk all over each other, we can also walk the sky. Like this, like this. I've also been thinking about it this way. Fathomable boundaries provide the basis of consensus reality, the unfathomable marked as impossible. Thus, excess is pent up with periodic eruptions, fragments of acidic bile plopping onto unwilling ground. The ground rumbled its exclamation, "Don't you know that reality means change? Change means transition. Transition means instability. Instability requires occasional grounding." Align your body by choice to the field lines that push and pull you rhythmically, away from the horizon of the profit makers. Gums again. Our teleportation was slow, and it completely rearranged us. We never put ourselves back together the same way again. It was a daily practice, slowly changing our sound from the inside, chanting and singing and listening deeper, moving in response to older harmonies than the reactive ones around. So perhaps this is enchantment, not as nostrum, but rather as motivator. Jane Bennett says, "The world comes alive as a collection of singularities. Enchantment includes, then, a condition of exhilaration or acute sensory activity. To be simultaneously transfixed in wonder and transported by sense, to be both caught up and carried away, enchantment is marked by this odd combination of somatic effects." Dearest, did the varying utterances swerve your trajectory into the cycles that you are infused with but have forgotten? Adriana. Dearest interlocutor, time's torsions twist targets tidally, terribly tumbled together. Time is not singular. There's not a singular time stream. Time doesn't exist on a flat surface. Temporal distances do not function like the distances between 2 points on the surface of a geographic map. At this very moment, we are but the condensation of billions upon billions of temporal cycles. The cycle of the accretion and dissolution of Sol, the sun, the cycle of Sol's orbit around the galactic center, the vibrations of the atoms that make up the cell walls in your intestines, the rhythmic pulses of neurons firing in your brain, the centuries-long cycle of capitalist subjugation, barely perceptible cycles of queer historical touches from pasts lost to us, the diurnal cycle of waking and sleeping, the new moon and the full moon, the morning and evening appearances of Venus, the biweekly replacing of transdermal estrogen patches. Not to mention the seeming boundaries of this cycle that we call life, birth and death. Of course, the limits of that particular cycle are merely convenient bookends, and our own physical material is itself recycled materials from other life, other stellar explosions, other manifestations of the cosmos. There's something peculiar about my own experience of life where I feel the overlappingness of these cycles simultaneously. The rarity of our singular existences being the result of the particular constellations of all of these cycles right here, right now. There's something undoubtedly overwhelming yet beautiful about all of this. For some reason, it makes this life feel a little less lonely somehow. As Michel Serres has described it, time flows in a turbulent and chaotic manner. It percolates. I had wanted a way to express this in a manner beyond words, to hear the relationship between these temporalities, these cycles, and to hear their different lengths phase in and out of each other. As a result, I decided to create a module for my synthesizer called xenokinetics that does just this. It allows you to represent cycles from the quantum to the cosmic in terms of the number of milliseconds, or fractions thereof, of those cycles. While theoretically you could just let these cycles run at their normal rates, meaning a cycle that has a duration of 1,000 milliseconds could be put right against a cycle that runs for 120,000 milliseconds, I also wanted a way to bring these cycles closer to each other. So I also designed the module to allow for a scaling factor, to thus bring the 120,000 milliseconds, when divided by 100, to 1,200 milliseconds, which can then be placed and played against the 1,000 milliseconds to get really interesting sonic and rhythmic relationships. So in xenokinetics, it's not so much about the actual value of the lengths of these cycles, but more about the relative relationships between these lengths. Marcus Boone's thinking, I think, building upon the Michel Serres quote I mentioned earlier, resonates with this idea. Musical time, then, would be also bring things close together via a vibratory transformation of space that changes our perception of time in striking ways. In fact, this is as good a definition of what rhythm is as you can find. Rhythm as folding, as fascinating whirlpool, interrupting linear flow. Chaosmotic attractors, some desired, others reviled, must be perceived to be dealt with. You know already that the timelines don't flow in only one direction. Listen in, Adriana. Part 3, sonic entanglements. Coda. I've been reading the letters of Ashton Crawley to his friend, to his lover, Moth. 100 trillion neutrinos pass through each square of matter every second, though it is presumed to be the case that human flesh cannot feed them with central registers already discovered. Quantum physics verifies what we have always known, what Black folks and Indigenous folks and queer folks have known for such a long time. There are things that happen in the world, in the universe, that are not easily perceptible to human flesh. We cannot see on the quantum scale. Eyes cannot detect atoms, electrons, neutrons, photons. We simply feel the effects of such material, how these tiny particles come together, forming the building blocks of, while moving through matter. Thank goodness for the astrologers, for they also track the influences of other forces in the universe and their influence on human flesh. Namely asteroids that might have something to do with queerness, if in name only. And no, astrology is not just for the sun, the moon, and the planets. It covers the gamut of all the bodies in the solar system. So we can track the trajectories of these asteroids as they flow through the fields of the solar system and conjure queer narratives around their travels. Of course, astrology is also about power, about the thousands of years of watching the sky in order to make predictions. But that's a story for another day. Nevertheless, we can even observe these queer asteroids from our balcony in Belmer as they move through the sky over a couple of weeks. This is the asteroid 80 Sappho, a tiny little dot, a minuscule point moving across the celestial dome in the sky. We are too often estranged from what is directly above us at night, notwithstanding the perpetual cloud cover here which blocks our view. I've been trying to become more closely connected to it, perhaps bringing the time stream points of my childhood in contact with the time stream points of my present. And I want to bring others on this journey as well. Looking up not only connects us with whatever is out there, in whatever way that out there affects us down here, but it also links us up with the overlapping temporalities I'm so fascinated with, of the singular yet fundamentally related stories we tell about the wanderers above the planets. Like Venus, a star that is a planet that we see in the morning before dawn, in the evening after dusk, and which disappears every once in a while too. Venus blazes brighter than any other planet in the night sky, hence its importance to humans for thousands of years. The stories that are told about Venus the world over involve extreme transformations of the being that is often associated with this wandering light. There's often a trip to the underworld involved, from stories that come from the Sumerians to the present. In my retelling of this story that I'm developing, I see this instead as modes of transformation, of transition. That the time that Venus is hidden from view, the time between its transit from a morning to an evening star or back again, is a time that augurs great potential in practice of transformation. It just so happens that Venus, at the latitude that we live in, will disappear from view in the morning sky soon, from around April 10th to the 15th of July, when it will reappear in the evening sky. Consider what transformations you can do during that time, what inner or shadow work you can do, what outward or communal transitions you can facilitate, while Venus themselves is hidden away, manifesting their own transformation. And when Venus returns around the middle of July in the sky just after sunset, be sure to throw a big party. Just want to finish up by saying I'm very grateful to lots of funders and support from lots of people for these projects. I can't thank them all, but it's important for me to say, so thank you.
Wow. I'm not sure we're going to get onto the quantum mechanics
that's fine.
lesson.
We can talk about that later.
But I actually realized I knew I recognized you. We had been on a panel together before.
Yes.
The Moon Gallery thing.
Yes, the Moon Gallery.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, you got to
Yes.
send something into space.
Yeah.
I didn't. But I gave a talk about space junk.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
I remember now.
that
Yes.
was awesome. Anyway, thank you so much for that.
Yes, thank you.
So rich
Appreciate it.
and, well, generous, really, and to take us with you on this journey, right? So we have some time for basically about 2 questions because we started a little late. So I'm going to try and pick some from, look at my crazy notes here. Okay. I think I'd like to know first about a different kind of transition,
Sure.
one you made that on paper looks like you made from science to art.
Yes.
Do you even use that word? Art?
Yeah.
I mean, we'll get to it. In case you don't know, Adriana holds a PhD in information science from Cornell. Before that, you have a master in science from MIT. For most of us mortals, making such a transition is enough. I mean, you know. But for you, if you do indeed now identify as an artist, what's the equivalent of the hormone patches that you need for that?
Well, so my original goal was to become a scientist and to be a biologist. I went to Caltech for my undergraduate, which is a very heavy science school as well in the US. And so the plan was always to do that, but I was also always performing as a musician, as a classical musician, so violin and viola. So I always had these 2 things going on. And I really wanted to go to a liberal arts college, but that didn't work out, so I ended up going to the science school. And then after I graduated, I started working in a neuroscience lab for a couple of years, where we were studying how the brain processes faces and objects. We would put people in MRI machines and scan them and so forth. And then we started studying music. And I wanted to maybe include things other than Mozart, because that was sort of the limit of what was allowed to be studied within the scientific realm. I wasn't able to do that.
I feel really sorry for your teacher.
Yeah, so I got very frustrated by that. So then I went to MIT and sort of joined this media arts and sciences program, and that really opened up a lot of worlds for me, because I was also able to take some art courses with some artists who were teaching in the former Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT CAVS, which was very much involved from the late 1960s in sort of incorporating art, technology, and science together. And cybernetics, exactly. However, when I was at MIT, I also started reading Foucault and Haraway. Well, so I started reading Foucault and Haraway, and that was not really acceptable. There was a lot of pushback because there was an idea that we were supposed to make and not sort of necessarily think about these things. Hence, I went and did my PhD at Cornell with someone named Phoebe Sengers, who I sort of ascribe a lot of importance to as my mentor, who had her own PhD in artificial intelligence and cultural studies. So she understood that interrelationship. As a result, I was able to sort of then move into that area.
So that I see. So in fact, that transition had already been begun before Cornell.
Yeah.
You were already on that swerving trajectory.
Yes, indeed.
And you were, indeed.
Yes.
Who'd have thought that Foucault was your bridge in that sense?
Exactly.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really a remarkable story, and especially since you have so many choices and possibilities. So let's talk about that. I mean, how do you indeed stay grounded? Because this is getting a bit psychological, isn't it?
Yes.
But anyway, that's what I kept thinking. When you were talking about the intersecting fields, I often, when I'm with my research group, some members of them are here, which is great. And Coquillique is one of them this year, which is cool.
Amazing.
We're roaming all over the place in terms of conceptual, trying to find material for our conceptual frameworks. But I always advise that you identify a home base to bring it all back to.
Yes.
And I think that's how you describe the grounding, right? So can you talk us through some of your dilemmas where you felt you've begun to get lost in these shifting fields, between these shifting fields, and how, in fact, do you bring yourself, how do you ground yourself, or what works in that case?
I mean, there's a couple of strands to that. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't say the importance of chosen family, right? My biological mom is very supportive of me, but also sort of like chosen family. Anyone who's queer or trans understands that. And so sort of having that ability is huge, to be able to talk about these things and stuff like that. But also, I really find my grounding within science fiction.
Oh, right. I did not expect you to say that.
Well, because and in sort of feminist, queer, trans, post-colonial, et cetera, science fiction, that's been out there for decades, but is certainly having a sort of vibrant period right now. And so I use that as a way to sort of think about imagination. And because in order to get up in the morning, I have to believe that art and writing and, fiction and things like this can change the world. And so that's sort of where I do that. In terms of getting lost, certainly, some of the things that I'm trying to work through right now, which are sort of the things that I was hinting towards at the end, which has to do with research that I'm currently doing about archaeoastronomy and into this whole other realm that I don't really have much experience with. That is feeling a little flittery at the moment. And so it's something that I'm struggling, because it's also trying to take seriously, or needing to take seriously, obviously, very different modes of thought and things that I believe in, but maybe we don't necessarily want to talk about sometimes, the big spiritual word, and things like this that is coming up in my work a lot. And when I was invited to speak here, and I was realizing that the whole theme was around the spell of the sensuous, I'm like, oh yeah, that's when that swerve began to happen for me. So it's a nice sort of coming back to that moment when I realized I need to really engage with this in my life and in my practice somehow.
So are you organising something on the 15th of July or involved in something?
I want to, except for I'm going to be in another hemisphere. I'm going to be in another hemisphere. I have a residency in Yogyakarta. You
said atmosphere, and I almost believed you.
I'm going to be in Yogyakarta for a residency, working with Venza Christ in Indonesian Space Science Society.
Oh, well, amazing, because I was going to say, you won't be able to see much of the sky from Yogyakarta, but if you go a bit further out, amazing.
Yeah, that's what we're planning on doing, and doing some research about some of these issues that I was bringing up at the end that I'm interested in.
Well, amazing. Well, last question, because it's too much. But you explained how a lot of your work is intended to be a provocation, to invite a conversation. And I kind of want to hear your thoughts on how we, not fix capitalism, because I don't think you'd use such a reductive word, but introduce entanglement into the binary or something. But how, with that provocation that you're obviously working through, or as a baseline in so many of your projects, where should that conversation take place and with whom?
So, as artists, let me back up. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book called How Noise Matters to Finance. And so I really sort of spent a lot of time, and noise in the sense of noise as sonic and informatic and so forth. And as a result, I was sort of reading a lot of things about finance and financial capitalism, the history and so forth. And so, I realized sort of how much of this assumption, or how much the entire financial sector is predicated on certain assumptions and certain beliefs. And if we change those beliefs, poof, right? And obviously that has a lot of impacts. And obviously I'm not a big believer in just things going poof, because we have to manage obviously what happens. And so I feel like this is something where people who have lots of power in society should also be reading certain types of fiction and listening to certain types of artists. Maybe that's naive, but it's also something where I feel like like Astrida Normanis was saying yesterday, referencing Gosh, right? It's a crisis of imagination. It's a crisis of imagination.
I utterly believe that. So we need to get Elon Musk into a science fiction book club then.
Well, actually, one thing I wanted to say about that is there is one, from my perspective, and again, I'm not trained in economics or anything like this. However, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future.
Did you go see him when he came here?
I wasn't able to, no. If you haven't read it, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future is a potential blueprint of how to move from where we are right now. And, it's not the be-all, end-all of these conversations, of course, but I think it's actually a really plausible way of at least changing things a little bit.
And he doesn't use the word hope. No, that's it. He's not optimistic. He's hopeful.
He's
right?
hopeful. Yes.
Yeah. So that's a great note we can end this on. But I'm sad to cut it off, but we do have to because we have two more amazing speakers to hear from. But let's join once again in thanking again Adriana Knouf.
Thank you.